The Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the world came the closest it has ever been to full-scale nuclear war. It started when the United States discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles could strike major American cities in just minutes. The U.S. government considered this a direct threat. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors debated what to do. Some wanted to launch an airstrike or invade Cuba immediately. But Kennedy chose a naval blockade instead, calling it a quarantine. This meant U.S. ships would stop any Soviet ships from bringing more weapons to Cuba. For 13 tense days, the world waited. U.S. and Soviet forces were on high alert. Any mistake could have triggered war. Back-channel communication helped. Secret talks between the U.S. and Soviet Union led to a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended, but for nearly 2 weeks, the world was one step away from nuclear destruction. The Soviet nuclear false alarm. On September 26, 1983, the world almost ended because of a computer error. That night, Soviet early warning satellites showed that the United States had launched 5 nuclear missiles. Alarms went off at the Soviet command center. The system said the missiles were coming straight toward the USSR. The officer in charge was Stanislav Petrov. His job was to report any missile attack to higher command. If he confirmed the alert, the Soviets would launch a full-scale nuclear retaliation. But something felt off. Petrov thought it didn't make sense. Why would the U.S. launch just 5 missiles instead of hundreds? He suspected it was a false alarm. Instead of reporting the attack, he told his superiors it was a system malfunction. He was right. Later investigations showed that sunlight reflecting off clouds had confused the satellite sensors. There were no missiles, just a glitch. Stanislav Petrov stayed calm and made a critical decision. If he hadn't, the Soviet Union might have launched a nuclear war by mistake. Able Archer 83. In November 1983, NATO ran a military exercise called Able Archer 83. It was just a training drill, but it looked very real. The exercise simulated a full nuclear war scenario, from raising alert levels, to communications, to even preparing for launches. NATO officers acted like it was the real thing. But here's the problem. The Soviet Union didn't know it was fake. Tensions between the US and USSR were already high, and the Soviets believed this exercise might be a cover for a real attack. So they panicked. The USSR put their nuclear forces on high alert. Some Soviet pilots even sat in their planes with engines running, ready to take off. Behind the scenes, intelligence officials in the West started to notice strange Soviet activity. But they didn't fully realize how close things were to disaster until years later, when documents were declassified. Able Archer ended on November 11th. No missiles were launched, but the world had been just one misunderstanding away from nuclear war. The NORAD moon mistake. In October 1960, deep inside NORAD's command center, alarms suddenly went off. The computers were reporting something terrifying, a massive wave of Soviet missiles coming over the North Pole toward the United States. It looked like the start of a nuclear war. Bomber crews were scrambled. Missile teams were put on alert. Washington was moments away from deciding whether to fire back. But some officers weren't convinced. The system was showing hundreds of missiles, but radar wasn't backing it up, and satellites saw nothing. After double-checking, they found the real cause: the rising moon. A radar system had mistaken the low-angle full moon over Norway for a missile attack. The signals bounced back just right, and the computers interpreted it as incoming Soviet weapons. It was a technical glitch caused by nature. The alert was canceled. Bombers stood down, and the world kept spinning, no thanks to the moon. The 1995 Norwegian rocket incident. In January 1995, scientists in Norway launched a research rocket to study the Northern Lights. It was a joint project with the US, and Norway had informed 30 countries ahead of time, including Russia. But somehow, that message never made it to the right Russian officials. Radar operators near Moscow picked up the rocket. Its path looked very similar to that of a U.S. submarine-launched Trident missile. They thought it might be the start of a nuclear attack meant to knock out Russian command systems. Russia's nuclear command system was activated. For the first time in history, President Boris Yeltsin opened the nuclear briefcase, the Chaget, and prepared to authorize a counterattack. Missile crews were put on high alert. For several tense minutes, Russian leadership tried to figure out what was going on. Then, nothing happened. No second missile, no follow-up attack. Russian analysts concluded it was a false alarm. The launch was just a research rocket after all. Boris Yeltsin closed the briefcase, and the world moved on, unaware of how close it had come to disaster over a weather experiment. The Soviet submarine incident. October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis had the world on edge. A Soviet submarine, B-59, was near Cuba, deep underwater. It had been hiding from U.S. Navy ships, which started dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface. What the Americans didn't know: B-59 had a nuclear torpedo on board, and the crew hadn't heard from Moscow in days. They didn't know if war had already started. Conditions inside the sub were terrible: over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, no fresh air, and extreme stress. The captain of B-59, Valentin Savitsky, believed a war might have already begun. He wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo, but he couldn't do it alone. Launching the weapon required agreement from 3 officers on board. 2 agreed: the captain and the political officer. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. He argued they should surface and wait for orders. They listened to him. The submarine rose to the surface and made contact. No torpedoes were launched. No war began. One man's refusal to press a button may have saved millions of lives. The 46-cent glitch. In the early morning hours of 1980, a regular shift at NORAD suddenly turned into a nightmare. Out of nowhere, computers at the North American Aerospace Defense Command lit up with a terrifying alert. A full-scale nuclear attack was incoming from the Soviet Union. Hundreds of missiles appeared to be headed straight toward U.S. targets. The U.S. military went on immediate high alert. Bombers were scrambled. Nuclear missile crews were ordered to stand by. This looked like the real thing, and there were only minutes to decide whether to fire back. But something didn't add up. Radar and satellite systems, which would normally detect real missile launches, showed nothing. There were no heat signatures, no movement, no signs of any real threat. Eventually, the alert was called off. It was a false alarm. The culprit? A single computer chip inside a communications system had failed. It cost just 46 cents, but its failure had fed fake launch data into the system. One tiny hardware malfunction had brought the world seconds away from nuclear war. The Goldsboro nuclear bomb incident. In January 1961, a B-52 bomber was flying over Goldsboro, North Carolina, carrying 2 nuclear bombs. Each bomb was more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. While in flight, the plane suffered a mechanical failure. It broke apart midair. As the bomber fell, both nuclear bombs dropped. One landed safely, but the other? It went through all but one of its safety mechanisms. Out of 5 safety switches, 4 failed. That means if one more switch had failed, there could have been a full nuclear explosion right in the middle of the U.S. It would have destroyed everything for miles. Later investigations revealed just how close it came. One official even said the bomb was 1 switch away from detonating. This incident shocked the military. It raised serious questions about how safe U.S. nuclear weapons really were. And most people, they had no idea it even happened. If you like this video, check out this one. Consider subscribing as well.